Rome ruled the world, but most Romans lived one accident away from death. They slept in collapsing buildings, ate just enough to survive, and vanished from history without names. This is not the story of emperors. It is the story of everyone Rome depended on, and ignored. Chapter 1. An empire built on inequality. Rome projected power through stone. Temples, forums, aqueducts, and triumphal arches were designed to communicate permanence and order. But this monumental image concealed a demographic reality that ancient writers acknowledged but rarely centered. The majority of Rome's population lived without wealth, security, or political influence. By the 1st century CE, the city of Rome may have held over 1 million people. Most owned nothing beyond their clothing, tools, or rented space. Wealth in Rome was intensely concentrated. Land remained the primary source of power, and by the late Republic large estates, latifundia, were controlled by a narrow senatorial and equestrian elite. Conquest flooded Italy with enslaved labor, displacing small farmers and driving rural populations into cities where work was unstable and poorly paid. Augustus and later emperors did not reverse this system, they stabilized it. Legal privileges, tax exemptions, and political offices continued to protect elite wealth, while offering little structural mobility for those below. The Roman poor were not a single class. They included freeborn citizens reliant on irregular wages, freedmen bound to former masters through obligation, migrants drawn to the capital by imperial construction projects, and widows with no legal guardian or income. Roman law recognized them as citizens, but citizenship did not guarantee material security. Poverty was not viewed as a policy failure. Roman ideology treated inequality as natural, even necessary. Social hierarchy was reinforced through law, architecture, and public ritual. The state intervened only when deprivation threatened order. Rome did not attempt to eliminate poverty, it managed it. The empire's stability depended not on lifting the poor, but on keeping them contained, visible enough to control, and invisible enough to ignore. Chapter 2. Life inside the insulae, vertical slums of Rome. For most of Rome's urban poor, daily life unfolded inside insulae, multi-story apartment buildings constructed quickly, cheaply, and densely to house a growing population. By the early empire, these structures dominated the cityscape. Augustus attempted to regulate their height, and later emperors imposed limits after repeated disasters, but enforcement was inconsistent. Many insulae still rose 5 or 6 stories, built with timber frames, weak mortar, and minimal foundations. The lower floors were the most desirable. They were sturdier, closer to water sources, and safer in emergencies. These units were occupied by shopkeepers, artisans, or modestly successful freedmen. As rent decreased with height, poverty increased. The upper levels, reachable only by narrow staircases, were where the poorest lived. These rooms were often single spaces, with no running water, no latrine, and no heat beyond small charcoal braziers. Fire was a constant threat. Open flames were used for cooking and warmth, and Rome's fire brigades were limited and slow. Collapses were equally feared. The poet Juvenal described buildings that creaked under their own weight, while Martial mocked landlords who collected rent from structures already cracking apart. Archaeological evidence confirms frequent repairs and patchwork reinforcements rather than proper rebuilding. Sanitation was primitive. Chamber pots were emptied into streets or cesspits. Waste flowed through open drains, contaminating water sources used by those without access to private wells or fountains. Disease spread easily in these confined spaces. The insula was more than housing, it was a physical expression of Roman inequality. Social hierarchy was not only enforced by law and wealth, but stacked vertically, floor by floor, shaping how the poor lived, moved, and survived within the capital of an empire. Chapter 3. Hunger, Bread, and the Illusion of Care. Food insecurity shaped the lives of Rome's poor more than any other daily concern. The city did not produce enough grain to sustain itself. By the late Republic, Rome depended heavily on imports from Sicily, North Africa, and especially Egypt. Any disruption, storms, piracy, political unrest, could trigger immediate shortages. Hunger was not a distant possibility, it was a recurring reality. To prevent unrest, the state established the grain dole, known as the annona. By the 1st century CE, approximately 200,000 to 300,000 male citizens in Rome were eligible to receive monthly allotments of subsidized or free grain. Eligibility excluded women, children, enslaved people, and most non-citizens. Even for those enrolled, the ration covered only basic calories. It did not include oil, vegetables, or meat. Survival still depended on unstable income or informal support networks. Food shortages carried political consequences. Roman historians recorded multiple grain riots, including disturbances during the reigns of Tiberius and Claudius. Emperors understood that hunger threatened legitimacy. Public anxiety over food supply influenced foreign policy, naval security, and imperial administration. Control of Egypt, formalized after 30 BCE, was partly a strategy to secure Rome's grain lifeline. Diet for the poor was monotonous. Bread or porridge made from wheat or barley formed the staple. Olives, legumes, and cheap wine appeared when affordable. Meat was rare. Malnutrition weakened immune systems and shortened lives, especially among children. The phrase, bread and circuses, suggests generosity, but in practice it reflected containment. The grain dole was not welfare in a modern sense. It was a political instrument designed to stabilize the city, not to eliminate hunger. Rome fed its poor just enough to endure, and just enough to remain dependent. Chapter 4. Work without security, surviving day to day. For Rome's poor, work was abundant but unreliable. The city offered constant demand for labor, construction, hauling, street vending, dock work along the Tiber, craft workshops, and domestic service, but almost none of it provided stability. Employment was typically arranged by the day, paid in cash or food, and ended without notice. There were no contracts, no protections against injury, and no expectation of continued work. Many urban laborers depended on seasonal or imperial projects. Large building programs under emperors like Augustus, Claudius, and Trajan temporarily absorbed thousands of workers. But when projects ended, so did income. Rural migrants flooded the city seeking opportunity, further depressing wages. Competition ensured that labor remained cheap and replaceable. Illness or injury often meant immediate ruin. A broken limb, infection, or fever could eliminate a person's ability to work within days. Without savings or institutional support, families collapsed quickly. Roman law offered no compensation for injured workers, and charity was informal and inconsistent. The boundary between freedom and enslavement was dangerously thin. Debt bondage had been formally abolished, but economic desperation still forced individuals to sell themselves or their children into slavery, or accept long-term service arrangements resembling it. Others were condemned to labor through criminal penalties for theft or vagrancy. Freedmen faced additional pressure. Though legally free, they owed obligations to former masters, limiting mobility and independence. Women's labor, textile work, food preparation, caregiving, was essential but poorly paid and rarely recorded. In Rome, work did not guarantee survival. It delayed collapse. The poor lived one accident, one illness, or one missed payment away from hunger. Homelessness or loss of freedom. Employment sustained the empire's daily function, but it offered those who performed it no lasting security. Chapter 5. Disease, filth, and early death. Rome was celebrated for its engineering, but those achievements did not protect the poor from disease. Aqueducts delivered clean water to fountains, baths, and elite households, yet access was unequal. Many residents of insulae relied on public fountains that could be distant, crowded, or contaminated. Water stored in open containers quickly became unsafe, especially in summer months. Sanitation was equally divided by class. While Rome maintained an extensive sewer system, most notably the Cloaca Maxima, only a fraction of the population was directly connected to it. The urban poor used shared latrines, cesspits, or chamber pots emptied into streets and drains. Waste accumulated rapidly in overcrowded districts, attracting insects and rodents. Disease thrived in these conditions. Intestinal parasites were widespread, tuberculosis, respiratory infections, and skin diseases were common. Epidemics periodically swept through the city, including the Antonine Plague beginning in 165 CE. Likely smallpox, which killed millions across the empire. The poor, living in dense and unsanitary environments, were disproportionately affected. Infant mortality was extreme. Archaeological evidence from burial sites suggests that a large percentage of Roman children died before the age of 5. Malnutrition, contaminated water, and lack of medical care made survival uncertain from birth. Medical knowledge existed, but professional treatment was costly and inaccessible to most. Life expectancy varied sharply by class. Elite Romans who survived childhood could live into their 50s or beyond. For the poor, death often came much earlier. Rome did not conceal this reality. It accepted it. Early death was not viewed as a crisis but as an expected outcome of life at the bottom of the empire. Next, Chapter 6, Crime, Punishment, and Class Justice. Roman law presented itself as impartial, but in practice justice operated along class lines. Legal penalties were calibrated not only to crimes, but to social status. Wealth and citizenship could shield individuals from the harshest punishments, while poverty exposed people to the full force of the system. For the poor, minor offenses carried severe consequences. Theft, debt fraud, vagrancy, and public disorder were punished swiftly and publicly. Whipping, forced labor, and execution were common sentences. Torture was legally permitted during interrogations of enslaved people and lower-status defendants, but prohibited for elite citizens. The law assumed that truth could be extracted through pain, so long as it was applied to the right bodies. Prisons in Rome were not designed for long-term confinement. Facilities like the carcer served as holding spaces before trial or execution. Not as corrective institutions, punishment was meant to be visible and final. Public executions, crucifixions, and condemnations to the mines or arenas reinforced social boundaries and deterred dissent. Access to legal defense depended on wealth and patronage. Poor Romans often lacked advocates and faced magistrates alone. Fines, when imposed, could not be paid and were converted into corporal punishment or labor sentences. Justice became a mechanism that deepened poverty rather than resolved conflict. Roman writers rarely questioned this imbalance. Order mattered more than equity. Crime among the poor was framed as moral failure rather than economic desperation. The legal system did not address the conditions that produced crime. It managed them through fear, spectacle, and unequal enforcement, ensuring that poverty remained both a social condition and a punishable offense. Next, Chapter 7, Family, Children, and Brutal Choices. For Rome's poor, family life unfolded under constant economic pressure. Marriage was common, but stability was rare. Without property or secure income, relationships were shaped by survival rather than long-term planning. Roman law recognized marriage among the lower classes, yet offered little protection when hardship struck. The death, illness, or abandonment of a partner could dismantle a household overnight. Children were both dependents and contributors. From an early age, they worked, selling goods in the streets, assisting in workshops, hauling water, or performing domestic labor. Education, praised by Roman elites as a civic ideal, was largely inaccessible to the poor. Literacy rates remained low outside privileged circles, reinforcing generational inequality. One of the most disturbing realities was child exposure. Roman law permitted fathers to abandon newborns, a practice driven less by cruelty than desperation. Infants born into households already strained by hunger or debt were sometimes left in public places. Some were taken in and raised as enslaved labor, many died. This practice was not hidden or illegal, it was a socially acknowledged response to poverty. Widows faced particular vulnerability. Without a male guardian or income, many were forced into informal labor, dependency on patrons, or unstable partnerships. Extended family networks could offer support, but they were equally fragile under economic strain. The emotional toll of these conditions is rarely recorded directly. Elite Roman sources focused on law and morality, not suffering. Yet burial inscriptions, skeletal remains, and legal texts point to lives marked by loss and difficult choices. For the poor, family was both a source of resilience and another front where poverty demanded sacrifice. Next, Chapter 8, Religion, Hope, and Escape Fantasies. Religion offered the Roman poor something the state did not, meaning beyond endurance. Official Roman religion emphasized civic rituals, public sacrifice, and the favor of gods. Who protected the empire? Participation was expected, but the benefits of these relationships appeared distant. To those living on the margins. Among the poor, religious practice was often personal and practical. Household shrines honored minor deities associated with protection, health, and survival. Amulets, charms, and divination were common, reflecting a belief that fate could be influenced in small but vital ways. Superstition flourished not from uncertainty, but from uncertainty. Mystery cults gained popularity among lower status groups. The cults of Isis, Cybele, and Mithras promised protection, belonging, and in some cases, salvation. Beyond death, these movements cut across class lines but resonated strongly with those excluded from traditional power structures. Initiation offered identity and community where the state offered none. Early Christianity emerged in this environment. Its message appealed to the poor not because it promised material relief, but because it reframed suffering. Teachings that elevated humility, condemned excess wealth, and offered hope of divine justice after death attracted enslaved people, women, and the urban poor. Roman authorities later perceived this appeal as destabilizing. Religion functioned as a psychological survival tool. It provided structure, explanation, and hope in a world where social mobility was rare. For the poor, faith did not erase hunger or danger, but it offered a way to endure them with purpose and sometimes with quiet resistance. Next, Chapter 9, Why the poor rarely appear in history. Most of what is known about ancient Rome was written by men who never experienced poverty. Senators, administrators, and educated elites produced the histories, speeches, and literature that survived. Their concerns were political power, moral decline, military success, and elite competition. The daily lives of the poor appeared only when they disrupted order, or served as symbols in moral arguments. Writers like Cicero, Livy, Tacitus, and Suetonius mentioned the urban masses largely as a collective force, crowds that rioted, demanded grain, or applauded at games. Individual voices are almost entirely absent. Poverty itself was not considered a subject worthy of sustained examination. It was assumed, not analyzed. What fills some of this silence is archaeology. Excavations of insulae, burial grounds, tools, graffiti, and skeletal remains provide indirect evidence of how the poor lived and died. High rates of malnutrition, childhood mortality, and physical stress appear clearly in bones, even when texts remain quiet. Inscriptions, often brief and formulaic, sometimes record freedmen, laborers, or children whose lives left no literary trace. Legal texts also reveal inequality through omission. Laws describe penalties and obligations, but rarely outcomes. They show how the poor were regulated, not how they felt. Even satire, such as Juvenal's work, exposes hardship only through exaggeration and elite disdain. This absence is not accidental. History preserved the perspectives of those with leisure, education, and political relevance. The poor sustained the empire, but they did not narrate it. Their invisibility is itself evidence of how Roman society valued power over experience, and silence became another layer of inequality. Chapter 10, The Empire. From below, viewed from its monuments, Rome appears ordered, disciplined, and enduring. Viewed from below, it was precarious. The empire depended on millions who labored without security, lived without protection, and died without record. Their work built roads, raised walls, unloaded grain ships, and maintained the daily life of the capital. Yet their survival was never the state's priority. Rome did not collapse because it ignored the poor. It functioned because it did. By managing poverty rather than eliminating it, the empire maintained a labor force that was cheap, replaceable, and politically contained. Grain distributions, public spectacles, and selective charity reduced unrest without altering structure. Inequality was not a flaw in the system, it was a condition of its stability. The poor were essential to Rome's economy but excluded from its rewards. They appeared in history only when hunger turned into riot, when crime disrupted order, or when new religious movements threatened authority. Otherwise, their lives passed largely unrecorded. Understanding Rome from this perspective reframes its greatness. The empire's power rested not only on legions and emperors, but on an underclass that absorbed risk, hardship, and early death. Rome's achievements were real, but they were unevenly shared. Its longevity was built on endurance demanded from those with the fewest choices. To see Rome clearly is to recognize both realities at once: the splendor above and the struggle below. The empire stood for centuries not because it lifted its poorest citizens, but because it learned how to live with their suffering and make it invisible. Rome is remembered for its emperors, legions, and monuments. But empires are not sustained by marble alone. They endure through ordinary lives under extraordinary pressure. If history matters because it reveals how power truly works, then these stories, from below, are the ones worth remembering.